For us to get going, so Scott's going to begin our class in prayer. Amen. All right, let's go ahead and jump into Bible class. Open your Bibles to the book of Acts. We have obviously a lot of guests with us today. We here at Edwards Lake, we do a 3-year cycle through the Bible where we just go essentially through the whole Bible every 3 years. And last year, we were going through, at the beginning of the year, we were going through, I think, the divided kingdom, the minor prophets, and those types of things. And I thought, well, it'd be good for us to have a sermon series on some New Testament things. So I did a year-long, every other week sermon series through the book of Acts. Not thinking about the fact that my sermon series on Acts was going to end right before we started the quarter on Acts for Bible class, which just did not work out very well at all. So we are taking a somewhat different approach to the book of Acts. So last year, we studied a lot of the stories of the book of Acts, and in this quarter, we've been looking at the social conditions, the kind of the background information of the different places in the book of Acts. And so we've done that. We've kind of gone city by city through the book of Acts, looking at the people, looking at the culture, looking at the conflicts they would have faced as a people, and especially as Christians walking into those cities and trying to teach the gospel to people. Today, we're kind of moving into near the end of the book of Acts. So go ahead and open your Bibles to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21. We just got through talking about the trials that Paul and particularly Paul was undergoing. Paul has been arrested, and one of the things that we talked about we need to have a better understanding of is what ancient prisons were like, what it would have been like to be arrested. And because Paul was arrested in several different places, that requires us to look at prison and house arrest and those types of things from several different places. So that's what we're going to do today. Paul, we know from the story, gets arrested in the city of Jerusalem. And there in the city of Jerusalem, some conflict arises where he's come in. The Jews from Asia are in town for a feast. They stir up trouble because Paul is that troublemaker they haven't been able to get rid of, even though they've tried again and again and again. And so they essentially make false accusations against Paul. He's come into town, he's stirring up trouble, he's been stirring up trouble all over the world, and he has brought Greeks into the temple. Like that's the big no-no. That's what you're not allowed to do, but they accuse Paul of doing that even though it's not true. Well, Paul ends up getting beaten there by the people. He gets rescued by the commander of the soldiers there. They essentially bring him to trial there in Jerusalem. It does not go well. Paul, understanding that it's not going well, basically does start a riot among the Jewish people, starting up a debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he gets carted away to Caesarea. So that's kind of where we left it on Wednesday night, and I thought it would be good for us to take a little bit of a break and talk about the prisons that Paul would have been facing over the next several chapters and years of his life. So as a whole, here's where we're going for those who are regular attenders here. We're going to talk today about prison life. We're going to talk Wednesday about ship travel and shipwrecks and how all that would have gone from an ancient world standpoint. We still need to cover the city of Rome itself. We have not talked about Rome. And then, of course, lessons that we learned from the book of Acts. That's where we're headed. So there were basically a few different types of prison or jail times that you would have suffered under the ancient world. As a whole, long-term incarceration was not something that was practiced. So the idea of Paul being in prison for years is a somewhat unique circumstance because that was something that was not really agreed with in the ancient world. They considered long-term incarceration to be inhumane, and it was something that was greatly taught against. And so essentially, typically, you were thrown in jail for two purposes. One was they were holding you for trial, so they needed to keep you contained for trial. The other was they would throw you into a place where you would not survive very long, and those were for the real bad enemies of the state. You were not expected to be a long-term person. They weren't going to feed you. You were basically thrown in a hole to starve to death. Like that's the way this would typically go. They thought that keeping a man restrained for years and years was something that was just not okay, and so it wasn't something they would do. For Paul, yes, Dallas? Yep. You know, the more humane options, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so that typically what they would do is there was either a swift punishment of some sort, like that. You had a hand cut off, you had major fines that you had to pay, those types of things. Or you were executed. Like those were generally the options they preferred to undergo. Long-term incarceration was a drain on the state. It wasn't something that they necessarily had guards and prison systems and all that sort of stuff like we do in America today. It was a get punished, be done with it, move on. And that's the way it typically would happen. Acts chapter 16, you've got the story of Paul and Silas in jail there. If you remember that story, this is right before the story of the Philippian jailer. Paul and Silas were thrown into prison, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, what that would have been like. There is the story in Acts chapter 23 where he is taken to Caesarea, and we'll talk about what those prisons would have been like as far as we know. And then we have what's called the house arrest. And we'll talk about what that would have been like, and we actually have a video about that if I can make it work. And then an underground dungeon, which I'll show you what that would have been like also. Possibly, maybe, Paul endured that for a brief time. There is a tradition about a particular underground prison in Rome where they think that Paul and Peter might have been kept for a while, but there's absolutely no evidence of it whatsoever. But just in case, I'll show you pictures of that, and you can get an idea of what that would have been like as far as what they were enduring. So holding cells essentially look like that on the screen. It's a hole, and they would have put bars in front of it, and it would have just been exposed. Like that's generally, now in my head, I grew up thinking probably more like the movies. So you've got this long, dark tunnel going down, and then there's cells on each side of the tunnel, and that's what the guard, the Philippian jailer, would have been guarding. That is probably very far from the truth. There is no evidence that any of their jails looked like that. They did have barracks that looked like that. You'll see that in the video I show you. But those were for soldiers, not for prisoners. Prisoners generally in Rome, one of the major punishments for any sort of criminal was humiliation and embarrassment. So to tuck somebody away in a place where they're not going to be seen, where they kind of have some privacy, that was not the way they did it. I mean, you think about crucifixion, what is one of the major parts of crucifixion but the public humiliation of stripping a man naked and hanging him up publicly for everybody to jeer at him, mock him, throw things at him. That public humiliation side was a big part of the punishment. And so the holding cells, for instance, in Philippi, like this one, they were exposed to the public. You would put somebody essentially in a hole where you would sit, they would chain you up, they would block it off, and they would shove quite a few people into that hole, as many as they needed in order to wait for jail the next, or for court the next day. And so this is what we probably need to picture when we read stories like Acts chapter 16, where Paul and Silas and other prisoners that are unnamed, we just know there are others there because Paul says nobody has escaped, that this is essentially what they were doing. They were a bunch of men, maybe women, shoved into an alcove that was blocked off, and it was a place where all day long the public could come by and make fun of them and jeer at them and say ugly things to them and throw things at them, and that was kind of a common thing. So if you picture Paul and Silas singing, that's what you're picturing. Sitting in a carved out spot of stone, sitting because you can't stand up, in there with a bunch of other people singing, kind of all crammed in there. And so that was the way this would work. Now again, you weren't kept there for years, you were kept there maybe for days. That's it. This was a place to hold you until the judge or the leader was holding session the next day and could hear the case and make a judgment. And judgments were generally made right there on the spot. There's no court, there's no deliberation, there's no all this other stuff. They made their judgment and the sentence was carried out. Yes, Penn? But possibly. So if you go back to Acts chapter 16, where you've got this story, they've been flogged. This is back in verse 23. He put them in the inner prison. So he one of these alcoves that you've got. About midnight, they're praying and singing hymns. Other prisoners are listening to them. There's a violent earthquake. The doors or the blockade, the bars, those kind of things were opened. Everyone's chains came loose. When the jailer woke up and saw that these places were open, he freaked out. I mean, it's dark. He's freaking out. And then Paul calls out, "Don't harm yourself because we're all here." I don't know if that means there are multiple holes or if that means just their came open and so all the prisoners in their hole could have escaped. But essentially, we're all here. We're all still here. And so that's when you have what brethren, what must I do to be saved? And then you've got the whole story of his baptism and those types of things. So again, that's just, in my head, I look at all of this and I go, that looks very different than the way I always thought this would be. Because I'm thinking typical prison, long hallway, what you see in like medieval movies, the prison cells underneath a castle, those types of things. Probably not the case here. Okay, probably much more much similar to what you see here in this picture. Okay, Scott? Yes, so yeah, maybe so. So again, we're basing this off of what we've found. We've found no prison system, prison building. What we find are alcoves that were clearly used as prison. So what inner means there, I'm not sure. So maybe a lot of times, maybe you would have an outer building and then an inner hole. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the more dungeon type setting. There would be in the rock multiple chambers, and so maybe there was an inner chamber to one of these alcoves, something like that. But that again, I want you to just realize, probably if you're like me, how different the reality was to what we think. Because again, I, for some reason, relate everything back to medieval times. So then you've got the Praetorium area in Caesarea. This is over in Acts chapter 23, after the story we covered on Wednesday night, where Paul is arrested, more out of an attempt to keep him safe from the Jews who were trying to kill him. The Romans came in, basically swooped in, and carried him off to safety. We know in chapter 23 he stayed there for 2 years, and he stays with the Praetorium. We don't really have an idea of what that is. I mean, we know what the Praetorium is. It was a group of soldiers, but we don't know what that means as far as location. We've not found any sort of prison in Caesarea. The best guess that people have is that it is somewhere in this region of this picture. This is a picture that Farrell Jenkins took. But maybe outside of Herod's palace, maybe somewhere between the Hippodrome and Herod's palace. I'll show you a blown up picture of that in just a moment. We do know that in this story he is accessible. So that's one thing we know. He is able to be brought out of where he is staying and brought to Felix. Felix is keeping him there on purpose. We talked about that on Wednesday night. Why was he keeping him there? Okay, so he wanted a bribe. So he was trying to make a buck off of Paul. A couple of other reasons. Okay, he's trying to keep the Jews happy. So the Jews, known rioters, they're always disturbing the peace. One way to keep them happy is to keep people who bother them out of their way. So if he can keep Paul out of the public, out of the spotlight, well, then now the Jews are going to be happier. They're not going to be rioting. That's a good thing. That's what Caesar demands, is peace in his kingdom. And so that's another reason. There was one more reason given. Anybody remember? He enjoyed talking to Paul. So it says that he just when he kept Paul there because he says, verse 26 of chapter 24, at the same time he was also hoping that Paul would offer him money. So he sent for him quite often and conversed with him. So if it were just money, you don't need to converse with him. But this idea of Paul was interesting. He was educated. He was somebody you could carry on a great conversation with, and Felix particularly liked that. So he kept Paul kind of as his, you have to be my buddy because I'm going to make you be my buddy. So he was his made-up friend kind of person. So it was a nice little arrangement for Felix until Felix got removed from office and Festus came in and took place. And Festus is like, I don't got no time for this. And so Festus starts taking care of things a little bit differently. You also know that according to this part of the story, Philippians chapter 1, verse 13, we're not sure if Philippians is written, we always call certain letters the prison epistles. We don't know if they are prison epistles from Caesarea or if they are prison epistles from Rome. Okay, that's kind of up for debate. It doesn't ever really identify it. We just know he was in prison when he wrote them. But we know that Paul had access to the whole Praetorium Guard. So we do see that according to Philippians chapter 1, verse 13, because he had a great effect on them. Philippians chapter 4, verse 22 talks about him having access to Caesar's household. So again, that's why a lot of people assume this is dealing with Rome, the Roman imprisonment, because that's more likely where Caesar's household is. If you're thinking Caesar's household means Caesar's family, more than likely household is just a generic term for those who served Caesar. So it could be either one still. There's no way to really know where this prison is. But most people think that probably the best guess we have, if my thing will work here, here you've got the palace of Herod. Over here, if you'll notice, you've got a hippodrome, which is a race course. And oftentimes beneath theaters, beneath hippodromes, beneath those types of places, coliseums, they would have holding cells. And so maybe he was given a place to stay in one of those places. Some even assume maybe he was given not a prison cell, because he is kept there for such a long amount of time, but he is given a room in the barracks. He was there with the soldiers, which would explain why he had easy access to the Praetorian Guard. It would explain why he had the ability to talk to Caesar's household or those who took care of Caesar. If he was being stationed with them or housed with them, it would make sense that you're able to converse with them, right? And teach them and be able to have an effect in those areas. And so, again, we don't know. There's no way to really know because we haven't found it. And so we're just kind of guessing based on what we would know, what we would assume based on the way these places worked. Then we've got the story of house arrest. And again, we think of that in terms of, somebody is restricted to their house, and that's where they're going to be under monitor. We have electronic monitoring and those types of things that we use in our culture today. Obviously, they didn't have those things back then. One of the major differences you have between what Paul experienced and what we would experience today is that he was caused to live in a house in a place where he didn't live. He had to rent the facility himself. He had to have all of his expenses paid, which is difficult when you can't go out and work. So you essentially had to live on the charity of other people in these typical arrangements. And he would all the time, ideally, be bound by a chain and guarded by a soldier. So that's generally the way this would work. He could receive company, he could write, he could continue to serve and do things in the community as long as he stayed in his house or stayed where he could be found. Ben? Maybe. Generally, selling yourself into slavery had more to do with debt than it did house arrest. So maybe, generally, just logically, so I'm going to make a really big assumption here to answer your question, but understand it's a big assumption. If somebody under house arrest, possibly to be executed by the government, comes to me and says, hey, can I have a bunch of money so that I can continue living and I'll pay you back whenever I get out, I'm going to tell them, no. I don't know that you're going to get out. I'm going to lose all this money. Generally, it was family and friends would send money in. And so that's why you have Paul, for instance, in the book of Philippians, make a big deal in Philippians chapter 4 about the money he's being given and that they're delivering the money to him through Epaphroditus and just how wonderful it is to receive that. But he doesn't have to have it. He learned to be content either way. He's had plenty. He's had little. It's interesting to hear a he's not convicted, but somebody who is arrested and under house arrest being like, I've had plenty, I've had little, I'm good, But that's why it was so valuable for churches to send Paul money, because honestly, it was the only way he survived. They had to bring him food, they had to bring him money, they had to bring him, he had to be able to pay somebody to go out and bring him things. So it was expensive to continue functioning in that situation. And we know that he lived that way for how long? 2 years, at least, maybe even a little longer. So that's quite a long time to be in that situation. Chris? I don't understand the question. Oh, so did it affect the judgment that came later? I don't know. So nothing I came across indicated one way or the other. My suspicion is no. I mean, if nobody came to care for you, nobody's given you food for 2 years, you're not going to make it to court anyway. You're dead, And so it's one of those types of things. If you can't pay for the facility and nobody is willing to be your benefactor, then what are you going to do? So that is. Other than that, I don't know. We're not really told. So I'm going to try a video. We'll see if this works. It did not work the other day, but I was doing this differently. And there might be an ad. I apologize if there is. There always is. It's YouTube. Oh, something went wrong. Is it going to do it? No, it's not going to do it. So again, I pointed this out to y'all on Wednesday night. There's a series of videos called Drive-Through History that are excellent at kind of going through and looking at the culture and the way things happened back then. There's one on, as we talked about, the traveling and how traveling worked, which we talked about last week. There's one on jails and how they worked, and they were, again, talking about the way the barracks worked and where the jails would be placed and those types of things. There's one, if I can get it working, that's on ships, travel and shipwrecks and those types of things. But again, I like them because they do all my work for me. I probably shouldn't say that. But again, for me, here we live in this time and age. We have our technology, our conveniences. We are so used to life being easy. I'm not saying there aren't hard moments, not saying that difficulties don't arise. But we don't face the same struggles that they faced back then. We don't face the same dangers that they faced. The idea of Paul going out there and sharing the gospel with people was an entirely different exercise and risk than what we experience today. And I love that Paul is of such determination and bravery, courage, that he is able to go out there knowing that this could be his future, but that's okay because the one he serves is worth it. And I am always convicted by that because here I am. I'm not worried about being thrown into jail. I'm especially not worried about being thrown into house arrest and having to finance staying alive in some form or fashion. I'm not worried about the difficulties of travel because I can hop in my car and go where I want to go, and the worst I have to deal with is $4.50 gallons of gasoline. Like that's it. That's my biggest worry, right? I might get a flat tire. Oh no. Like, I'm not worried about an animal coming and eating me while I sleep at night. Like that, there's a big difference between those two lives. And Paul was willing to go out and travel weeks on end to go from city to city so that he could possibly maybe have an effect in the next city, whereas we're the kind that will call ahead and make sure we have a place to stay of comfort before we or even agree to come, right? Like it's crazy, the difference. I look at us, preachers today, I'll pick on us. Preachers today, I have actually seen preachers go ahead and make their payment arrangement with the church they're going to preach for the weekend before they will agree to come because they want to make sure that it's worth their while. Think Paul ever did that? Or Peter, or Barnabas, or Silas, or any of these early Christians? Not at all. They were willing to go at risk of life, livelihood, of being arrested, of facing all sorts of dangers. They were willing to do whatever it took because the message was more important than the messenger. And we need to be that way. And unfortunately, we're not. And again, I find that so convicting, especially when you see places like this. Okay, underground dungeons that they could have been placed in. And generally, like I said earlier, Rome was not real fond of long-term incarceration. So when we talk about underground dungeons, we're not talking about being thrown in a hole where you will survive for the next 10 years of your life. No, these places were designed for your death. They were designed for disease. They were designed to give you a horrible existence from the time you're thrown in to the time you die within days later. They would throw you in naked, so you were completely exposed to the elements. These places were cramped. They would throw way too many people in these places. They were cold. They were often wet. You were not fed in these places. There was no food that was thrown in the hole ever. There was no help that was sent in. If you got injured in there, you were just going to bleed out. Like, that's just the way life was in these places. The places smelt horrible. I mean, there's no bathroom in these places. Well, not technically true. The whole thing was a bathroom. But that's a whole different scenario, right? I mean, could you imagine? We look at that and go, it's like being thrown to live in a porta potty, but worse. And I say that just because when I was thinking about bathroom, I was thinking about the one time we threw our friend in there and closed the door and started rocking the whole porta potty, kind of scenario. Could you imagine that being your future? And not of, okay, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to try to hold my breath for the whole time I'm in here because it's that nasty. No, this is where you will be from now until you die, which will probably be in a few days. And so this was a place where they would throw you to die. Like that. That's just the way this kind of place would go. And so Mamertine prison is one of the traditional places where they say, possibly, we do know of some political enemies that were thrown into Mamertine prison. We have records of it. People have tried to suggest, because it is an underground prison in Rome, that maybe Peter and Paul were thrown in there also. We don't really have records of that. Here's a picture of one of their underground chambers. This was one of those prisons that did have multiple chambers. The lowest chamber had its own spring, which was kind of nice because you could have water, which would help you survive a little longer. But the problem with that was it also kept everything moist, which kept fungus and all sorts of things growing in there, which just made the place rank and nasty and horrible. And so it again was that kind of place. They have found an altar that was built in Mamertine prison, but they believe it was probably built after it was used as a prison, not during its use as a prison, because that's not where you would go to live. Essentially, the way this would work is there was only one opening to the place, and it was a hole, and so they would uncover the hole, throw you in. It was just big enough to fit someone through, and then they'd cover the hole back up, and you're there. That's life. That's it. You're done. It was actually equated to the gates of Hades in several writings, or this was like being thrown into the underworld. That was the idea. And so the thought process here was, for the worst criminals, we are essentially going to throw you to the underworld. Good luck. And that was the punishment. We are just, we're not going to kill you and let the gods decide. We're just going to go ahead and send you straight to the underworld. And so that's the thought process with the way that this would work. And so again, this was a place where they would throw the true enemies of Caesar. And generally you were thrown there. If you were thrown there temporarily, which did happen, the idea was they would bring you out completely. If you survived the period of time that you were in there, you would be used in some sort of celebratory ceremony, a Roman triumph. A Roman triumph was when a general was essentially assigned a place among the gods, not as a god. They did do that with their Caesars. There was a whole ceremony and a parade that went through the town, but essentially they would have sacrifices involved in that. And one of the things that would happen in these triumphs is they would lead the prisoners in procession, and your triumph the one who beat you, the one who defeated you, would walk behind you, essentially declaring his victory over you. It was, again, a way of causing deep humiliation and shame to whoever was defeated. And then they would kill you at the end of that. So if you didn't die in the prison, you would die at the end of that. So pretty final judgment here, the way all of this would work. And again, part of the reason I want you to see this is because I think sometimes we have sanitized our understanding of the risk that these early Christians were taking. We know, we read about it, we have an intellectual understanding that yes, they were risking some things. But I don't know that we understand the immensity of what they were risking. To go out there and declare, I am a Christian, I belong to the way, this is what you were risking. If you were going to say, I belong to the way, it could be prison. It could be thrown at the mercy of the courts, which generally did not go in the favor of the Christian, because often they were used as scapegoats for other things. They were viewed as atheists, which is weird to us, but they did not believe in the gods. Therefore, you were a non-God believer. Like you did not believe in God, so you were considered atheist. They were considered murderers, oftentimes talked about as murderers, which ironically, they kind of created that problem for themselves. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. They were considered to be children killers. They killed their children. They were considered to be incestuous. So that was a big deal, that they would be incestuous. They were also considered to be cannibalistic. Now, if any of y'all have heard these, do y'all understand the explanation behind some of these? Why were they cannibalistic? Yeah, they ate the flesh of their Lord. Ooh. Okay. They were also considered idiots because they served a defeated miracle worker or magician, a sage, oftentimes he is called in the ancient literature. So they served a criminalized, defeated sage. They were cannibalistic. What about incestuous? Why were they considered incestuous? They married their brothers and sisters. Right? Like that's gross. But again, that's the way we talk. We understand all of that, but if you're completely unfamiliar with that kind of language, isn't that weird? They were considered murderers. Why? Do what? Yes and no. Not because of that language, but what causes us to kill the old man? We bury people in baptism. They die. We drown people. Right? We talk about dying in baptism, right? We're going to immerse you until you're dead. Like that's it, And again, we look at that and go, how stupid could they be? Well, this is language nobody had ever really used before. These are phrases that were unfamiliar. So if you're uninitiated, if you're unfamiliar, this group of people are awful. I mean, talk about a cult with bizarre ideas. That's the way. That's that group over there, that sect of Judaism, which we don't like the Jews anyway. But now you got a weird set of Jews. Like we don't have any time for them. And so it was easy to hate Christians. So when you agreed that Jesus was truly the Son of God and that he was worth following, you weren't just risking a potential maybe if you get caught in the wrong situation, you could, if things don't go your way, get thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. Honestly, a lot of that wasn't even happening much in the first century. That does happen a lot moving forward. But you were risking the mission, even doing the good work of Jesus carried so much risk that it was a huge undertaking. And we forget that. We don't think about the way that happens. And so you've got all these phrases in Scripture that talk about this idea. Paul often mentions his chains, both before he is arrested and when he is arrested. So he talked about the chains of belonging to Jesus.
He also talks about being a prisoner of Jesus Christ, those types of ideas. We know he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon from prison, either Caesarea or Rome, depending on your take on that. So you've got a very real sense from your church leaders that chains are in the future. Wouldn't you agree with that? The way they talk, even the way Jesus talked, take up your cross and follow me. What does that mean? Take up your cross and follow me. Okay, you're going to die. What'd you say? Okay, deny yourself. And again, we're okay with the idea of denying ourselves. I mean, we kind of are. We're not really practically, but we are when we talk about it in a Bible class. Like the idea of, yeah, I know I need to put myself aside and serve God, and God needs to be most important. But when you put it in terms like what Marshall just said, be willing to die, that's a little harder to swallow, right? Like, I remember when Tiffany and I were engaged, and somebody had asked me, so do you love her enough to die for her? And I'm like, yeah, no big deal. And I still should have that reaction. But I do. I'm really close to my wife. I mean, I would do whatever it took, put myself in whatever harm came my way for my wife and my children. For one of you, it's going to take me a few minutes to consider whether it's worth it or not. Like, I don't mean that to be ugly, but that whole self-preservation thing, like it's real. And I look at that and I go, so now I'm told by Jesus, you've got to be willing to die no matter what, give it all in order to follow and serve me. I need to consider whether that's true or not. Am I really that devoted? That's what Jesus says is required. Pen? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I mean, and so now it's not just die; it is carry your cross to your death. Okay, so we don't always add that part to it. So it's not just you need to be willing to die; it's you need to be willing to carry this burden from now until the day you die. Doesn't that add something to this whole discussion? Makes it a little harder to really wrap your brain around, is that what I'm really signing on for? Am I really okay with that? And that's hard for us because the burden we carry doesn't look anything like the burden Paul carried, does it? Because my burden's still pretty comfortable. My cross is kind of cushiony and lightweight. I can carry it around with me. It fits in my pocket sometimes. Like it's that simple. Paul's didn't. Am I willing to carry something as heavy as what Paul did and what Jesus did? Scott? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Pen?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things of, I think Jesus words it the way he does because he wants us to wrestle with, are we willing to truly give this much? Take up your cross and follow me. That's prisoner language. That's are you willing to do whatever it takes? Matthew chapter 25, verse 36, you've got that whole discussion where he talked about doing for the least of these. And one of the examples that he uses there is that visiting people in prison. That was a very real reality for these early Christians. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34. Again, you've got this idea of, for you sympathize with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions, because you know that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. So are we willing to not only sympathize with those we know that are in prison for the faith, that seems to be the implication here, but add to that, even have all your stuff taken away? You need to, you go live in destitute poverty because it all got taken from you because you are a Christian, but you're like, you know what? It's okay, I got better stuff coming. Like that's the reality we are asked to face when it comes to following Jesus. Chapter 13, verse 3. Remember those in prison as though you were in prison with them, and the mistreated as though you yourselves were suffering bodily. Are we doing that? I mean, I'll be honest. I don't know of a prisoner who is in prison because of his faith. Do you? I mean, realize how insulated we are. We have it so easy. I don't really even know anybody who is mistreated for their faith. I know plenty of people who are mistreated. I mean, I know people who are refugees right now because of the situation in Russia and Ukraine. That's mistreatment, but they weren't singled out because of their faith. That was just a political circumstance. Now, you look at this. If I did truly know that my friend that I worship with on a weekly basis is no longer attending worship with us because he's sitting and rotting in a jail because he wouldn't renounce his faith, that changes things for me. Something that wasn't real becomes very real very quickly. And I think it is worth wrestling with that. Revelation chapter 2, you've got Jesus' words to the churches here, and here to Smyrna. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you a crown of life. That sounds good. And I like to say, oh yeah, amen, that's me. Like that, I would do that, hands down, no questions asked. But I have never been tested that way. And I wonder about us. I wonder about the modern church, how strong we would be